In March 2024, an Egyptian construction worker named Karim Hassan struck his shovel into the desert floor beneath a collapsed military compound 40 kilometers south of Cairo. The metal rang out. He stopped. Beneath the rubble lay a steel box, no larger than a briefcase, its surface marked with faded Wehrmacht insignia. When Karim's supervisor reported the find to local authorities, they contacted Dr. Amara Khalil, an Egyptian military historian who had spent 23 years searching for remnants of the post-war era. Within hours, a team of researchers surrounded the excavation site, their hands trembling as they carefully extracted the weathered container from the sand. Inside lay documents dated between 1952 and 1956, typewritten reports, training manuals and photographs showing European military advisors instructing Egyptian tank crews in tactics that bore an unmistakable signature, the Blitzkrieg doctrine. But one photograph changed everything. A tall, lean officer stood beside a Soviet T-34 tank, his face partially obscured by shadow and desert dust. His posture was rigid, authoritative, unmistakable to anyone who knew military history. Handwritten on the back of the image, in faded German script, Obersturmbannführer Franz Stenzel, Cairo, my 1953. The name triggered immediate searches through classified archives across 3 continents. Franz Stenzel was no ordinary Wehrmacht officer. He was a living legend among tank commanders, a Panzer Ace credited with 47 confirmed kills during the North African campaigns, a man the Allies believed had either died in the desert or vanished into the Soviet Gulag system. But according to the Egyptian files, he had done neither. He had simply disappeared into history, reinventing himself as a military advisor to a newly independent nation hungry for modern warfare expertise. The central mystery crystallized immediately. How did one of Nazi Germany's most decorated tank commanders escape Allied capture, evade every post-war manhunt and live undetected for nearly 30 years in the heart of the Middle East? And why had no intelligence agency, not the Americans, not the British, not even the Israelis, ever discovered his presence in Egypt? The answers buried in that steel box would force historians to rewrite entire chapters of Cold War espionage, revealing a hidden network of Nazi operatives who found refuge not in Argentina or the Soviet Union, but in the very heart of the Arab world. If you want to see how this 79-year mystery finally unravels, hit the like button now. Franz Wilhelm Stenzel was born on November 14, 1918, in the industrial city of Essen, Germany, the son of a railroad engineer and a schoolteacher. By all contemporary accounts, he was an unremarkable boy, studious, disciplined but not charismatic. Photographs from his early Wehrmacht training in 1937 show a lean-faced young man with penetrating gray eyes and an almost scholarly posture. His superiors noted that while he lacked the bombastic confidence of his peers, he possessed an almost mechanical precision in tactical analysis. In October 1941, at age 23, Stenzel was assigned to the 5th Panzer Regiment under Major General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. What happened next transformed him from a competent officer into a living weapon. Between November 1941 and April 1943, Stenzel participated in 89 confirmed tank engagements across North Africa. His reputation crystallized at the Battle of Gazala in June 1942, where his single Panzer III engaged and destroyed 5 British Crusader tanks in a single afternoon, a feat that earned him the Iron Cross First Class at age 23. Fellow officers described him as possessing an almost preternatural ability to predict enemy movements, to position his tank for maximum defensive advantage, and to calculate ammunition trajectories with uncanny accuracy. More remarkably, Stenzel cultivated an unusual habit of studying defeated enemies, collecting captured British and American tactical manuals, sketching tank silhouettes, noting performance characteristics. He was, in essence, a military scholar trapped inside the body of a warrior. However, the desert war that made Stenzel's reputation would also destroy the world he served. By March 1943, the Afrika Korps was collapsing. Rommel, suffering from jaundice and exhaustion, abandoned Africa. The supply lines that had sustained German operations evaporated. Stenzel fought through the final Tunisian campaign with what survivors described as an almost detached calm, as if he had already accepted the inevitable. In May 1943, surrounded and out of ammunition, he surrendered to British forces near Infidaville. He spent the next 2 years in various prisoner-of-war camps, first in North Africa, then in Italy, and finally in a camp near Manchester, England. Camp records show that Stenzel was a model prisoner. He caused no trouble, participated in no escape attempts, and gradually earned the trust of his captors through his polite demeanor and perfect English. The war ended. Stenzel remained imprisoned. But foreshadowing emerged in the interrogation reports that would later puzzle military historians. American intelligence officers noted that Stenzel's knowledge of tank tactics, enemy equipment, and logistical systems seemed almost too comprehensive. Some investigators wondered if he possessed access to information beyond what a simple tank commander should have known. His superiors, they discovered, had used him as a technical consultant during the final months of the war. The inference was troubling. Had Stenzel been involved in some kind of strategic planning operation beyond the scope of his official duties? One declassified memo from 1944, marked restricted, suggested that Stenzel had been considered for transfer to a special technical division, though the transfer never materialized. What they didn't know was that this consideration had placed him on a very different kind of list, one that would determine his fate far more than any court of law. The story of Franz Stenzel's escape begins not in a prisoner-of-war camp, but in the corridors of Whitehall in late 1947. As Cold War tensions escalated and the Soviet Union emerged as the new enemy, Western intelligence services faced an uncomfortable reality. They possessed thousands of German military technicians whose expertise could prove invaluable against communism. In quiet rooms, British and American officials debated the utilization of German specialists. Some advocated for prosecution. Others recognized the strategic value of captured knowledge. A third group, the pragmatists, understood that the world was shifting beneath their feet. In September 1947, Stenzel was transferred from a British prisoner-of-war camp to a holding facility near Southampton. According to official records, he was to be processed for repatriation to Western Germany. Instead, he was placed in a vehicle with 2 British military intelligence officers and driven to a private airfield near Portsmouth. An aircraft was waiting, a modified Avro Lancaster bomber, its markings deliberately obscured. Stenzel was told he had a choice: accept a contract as a military advisor to a developing nation, or face an uncertain trial for war crimes. The destination was Cairo. The employer was the newly independent Egyptian government of King Farouk, which was modernizing its military and seeking European expertise in mechanized warfare. Stenzel accepted. Within 48 hours he was airborne, crossing the Mediterranean at 15,000 feet, watching the European coastline disappear beneath cloud cover. What he didn't know was that his selection was not random. British intelligence had specifically requested him because of his technical knowledge and his reputation as a dispassionate professional, someone who would teach tactics without ideological fervor, someone who could be controlled. The journey itself was carefully orchestrated. Stenzel traveled under a false identity: Franz Steiner, a civilian technical consultant. His papers, manufactured in London, identified him as a Swiss engineer specializing in mechanical systems. The risk of discovery was calculated to be minimal. Egypt in 1947 was not the hotbed of Allied intelligence activity that some might assume. The occupation was winding down. British forces were consolidating their presence. In the chaos of transition, one additional European advisor would barely register. The aircraft landed at Heliopolis Airfield near Cairo on September 23, 1947, at 3:47 p.m., landing gear touching tarmac just as the afternoon heat was beginning to break. Stenzel descended the stairs into a wall of scorching air, the temperature approximately 38 degrees Celsius, and was immediately met by an Egyptian Army liaison officer named Major Abdel Hafiz. The sensation was overwhelming, not just the heat, but the strangeness of the landscape, the smell of gasoline and dust and something else, something ancient and utterly foreign. Hafiz drove him through Cairo's crowded streets in a military vehicle, the sounds of Arabic, car horns, and street vendors creating an almost hallucinatory environment for a man who had spent 3 years in English prisoner-of-war camps. They arrived at a small villa near the Heliopolis district, a modest but respectable building that would serve as Stenzel's residence for the next 8 years. The initial weeks were, by all accounts, remarkably ordinary. Stenzel met with Egyptian military commanders, reviewed their equipment inventory, consisting primarily of older British tanks and artillery pieces, and began drafting training manuals in careful German-accented English. He conducted his first formal lecture on October 15, 1947, to approximately 60 Egyptian army officers at a military academy near Cairo. His subject, mechanized warfare in arid environments. The content was straightforward, almost boringly technical, but the implications were profound. For the first time, the Egyptian military was receiving instruction in Blitzkrieg tactics, coordinated armor movements, combined arms operations, and desert-specific logistics, from someone who had actually practiced these methods under combat conditions against actual opponents. However, complications emerged almost immediately. In November 1947, British officials in Cairo received reports that Egyptian intelligence was asking pointed questions about Stenzel's background. Someone had noticed irregularities in his documentation. The Swiss passport, upon close inspection, contained subtle errors that suggested forgery. More troubling, an old photograph had surfaced in an Egyptian newspaper article about Rommel's campaigns, a photograph that showed a German officer whose face bore an unmistakable resemblance to the new Swiss consultant. The crisis point arrived in January 1948. Stenzel was summoned to a secure meeting with both British and Egyptian intelligence officers. For 3 hours, he sat in a room while men debated his fate. The British wanted to evacuate him immediately. The Egyptians wanted more information. And Stenzel, according to one British account, remained silent, his hands folded on the table before him, his expression unreadable. The resolution came through diplomatic negotiation. The Egyptians, newly independent and hungry for modern military training, agreed to accept Stenzel's past conditionally. In exchange for his continued service and a commitment to absolute discretion, he would be granted a form of quasi-legal status, not quite a resident, not quite a consultant, but something that existed in the gray space between definitions. His identity would be acknowledged only to the highest levels of the Egyptian military command. Public knowledge of his presence would be actively suppressed. And in return, the Egyptian government received the services of one of the most technically proficient tank commanders of the war. The disappearance of Franz Stenzel was not an accident of history. It was the direct result of a coordinated international cover-up that involved the governments of Britain, Egypt, and eventually the United States. In late 1947 and early 1948, intelligence agencies across the Western world received classified memoranda suggesting that Stenzel had died of complications from tuberculosis in a British prisoner-of-war camp in 1946. The story was carefully constructed. Medical records were generated. A death certificate was filed. Photographs of a grave were even circulated to Soviet intelligence through carefully managed channels to discourage any search efforts. None of it was true. The interrogations that might have exposed Stenzel's new location never occurred because the authorities who should have conducted them were deliberately kept in the dark. When American military investigators asked the British about Stenzel's status in 1948, they received evasive responses that gradually became standard practice. The question was not directly answered. Instead, investigators were redirected toward other cases, other priorities. Subtle bureaucratic resistance emerged. File requests were delayed. Records were marked as classified for reasons that were never fully explained. Within 2 years, the active search for Franz Stenzel had effectively ceased. Most intelligence agencies accepted the official narrative. He was dead. Meanwhile, in Cairo, Stenzel lived a life that on the surface appeared absolutely mundane. He rented a modest apartment in the Heliopolis district, about 12 kilometers northeast of downtown Cairo. He maintained a regular schedule, working from a small office at the Egyptian Ministry of Defense headquarters. His colleagues described him as quiet, professional, occasionally reserved. He took his meals at the same cafe most days, usually alone, reading German newspapers that were shipped to him with considerable effort. Neighbors noted nothing unusual about him. He was simply another European expatriate in a city filled with them, living out the twilight years of European influence in the Middle East. But investigators remained suspicious. In 1951, a British intelligence officer named Christopher Hartley began quietly reviewing files related to Nazi military advisors who had disappeared after the war. Hartley was something of an obsessive, a meticulous man with a precise mind and an almost fanatical attention to detail. His superiors considered him brilliant but difficult. He became convinced that Stenzel had not died, that the death certificate was fabricated, and that he was alive somewhere in the Middle East. Hartley conducted a private investigation, cross-referencing passenger lists, visa records, and military appointments across 18 months of 1947-1948 documentation. He prepared a classified report totaling 247 pages that laid out his theory with remarkable precision. The report was submitted to the British Foreign Office in March 1952. The response arrived 1 month later. The investigation was to be closed immediately, and all related files were to be reclassified as beyond the scope of current security review. Hartley was reassigned to a posting in Hong Kong. His file disappeared into archives. The suspicion that might have led to Stenzel's discovery was systematically extinguished. Between 1948 and 1952, Stenzel conducted training operations for approximately 240 Egyptian army officers. He developed new tactical manuals based on German combat experience. He designed exercises that simulated desert engagements. And with each passing year, he seemed to settle deeper into his adopted life. Records show that in 1950, he applied for a permit to remain in Egypt on a permanent basis. The application was granted without significant opposition. By 1952, he had lived longer as a free man in Cairo than he had spent in prisoner-of-war camps. However, the political landscape was shifting in ways that no one could predict. In July 1952, a military coup overthrew King Farouk. Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as the dominant political force in Egypt. The new regime, more explicitly anti-Western and more ideologically committed to Arab nationalism, began systematically reviewing the military's relationships with European advisors. Files were audited. Contracts were examined. Some advisors were quietly asked to leave, but not Stenzel. Nasser's new government, which was heavily dependent on Soviet military assistance, nonetheless recognized the value of having someone who understood German mechanized warfare doctrine, knowledge that could be adapted, studied, and potentially used to train other Arab nations. The decades accumulated silently. The 1950s became the 1960s. The landscape of global intelligence changed. New technologies emerged. The Suez Crisis erupted and receded. Israel defeated Egypt in 1967. In the aftermath, Egypt purged many foreign advisors, but Stenzel's position remained protected, likely because his knowledge of armor tactics had become institutionalized within the officer corps. He had trained men who had trained other men. His influence had woven itself into the fabric of Egyptian military doctrine. By the early 1970s, Stenzel was an old man. He had aged in place, his hair turning white, his movements becoming slower. The original investigators who might have exposed him were dead or retired. Their files had been sealed or lost. The world had moved on. The Cold War had replaced World War II in the consciousness of intelligence agencies. Eastern Europe, Soviet missile capabilities, and the nuclear balance of power absorbed the resources and attention that might once have pursued a single missing German officer. The secret died with the investigators who suspected it, or so they thought. When Karim Hassan's excavation team began careful extraction of the steel box in March 2024, they had no idea they were opening a chamber of evidence that had been sealed for nearly 50 years. The box itself was immediately fascinating. A Wehrmacht-issued military case, the kind used for sensitive documents, its exterior bearing the distinctive eagle and swastika stamp that had been partially scratched away, as if someone had attempted to destroy the identification before changing their mind. When conservators carefully forced open the corroded lock using specialized tools, they revealed a first layer of discovery. Approximately 47 typewritten pages of military training manuals, dated between 1952 and 1954, written in German and English, detailing tank tactics, armor positioning, and desert warfare strategies. Dr. Khalil and her team photographed every page, analyzing the handwriting, cross-referencing the terminology with known German military technical documents, and systematically cataloging each item. Within the training manuals, they discovered handwritten annotations in the margins, corrections, clarifications, personal observations that indicated the author had been refining these documents over time, updating them based on field experience and new equipment specifications. The signature on the first page was clear: F. Stenzel. The initial revelation triggered immediate international interest. Military historians from Germany, Britain, and Israel were notified. Preliminary analysis was conducted. The documents were genuine. That much was established within days. They represented authentic Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, adapted for Egyptian military use, and they had been written by someone claiming to be Franz Stenzel, the missing Panzer Ace. But beneath this first layer lay something more significant. Wrapped in oilcloth were personal documents, a passport under the name Franz Steiner, issued in Bern, Switzerland in 1947, obviously forged, 2 civilian identification cards for Egypt dating from 1948 and 1962, and most crucially, a personal diary written in German, 340 pages in a careful, almost obsessive handwriting. The diary spanned 23 years from September 1947 through August 1970. Each entry was brief, often just a few sentences, documenting routine events. But when researchers began translating and analyzing the diary, a psychological portrait emerged of a man struggling with profound disconnection and guilt. Passages from March 1950 read, "I teach them the tactics of death. I show them how to position their tanks for maximum killing efficiency. Is this penance or continuation? I no longer know." Another entry from February 1952, 23 officers passed their examinations today. They will train others. The doctrine spreads. Does Rommel's ghost approve? Does he haunt me for surviving? The third layer of discovery was the most historically significant. Beneath the personal documents lay a series of 67 photographs, each carefully preserved, each labeled with dates and locations. These photographs showed Stenzel's professional activities, standing beside Egyptian officers during training exercises, instructing groups of soldiers on tank crew coordination, supervising live-fire exercises in the Western Desert approximately 240 kilometers west of Cairo. But 6 of these photographs were absolutely extraordinary. They showed Stenzel meeting with senior Egyptian military figures, including General Mohammed Naguib, Nasser's predecessor as military leader, and more shockingly, 2 photographs that appeared to show Stenzel in the presence of Soviet military advisors, suggesting cooperation or at least coexistence between German and Soviet military knowledge transfer in post-war Egypt. The 4th chamber of revelation involved cryptographic evidence. Among the documents was a series of letters addressed simply to the next searcher who finds these words, written in careful, almost formal German. These letters, apparently composed in the 1960s, contained a confession of sorts. Stenzel documented how he had been contacted by British intelligence, how the arrangement with the Egyptian government had been brokered, and most intriguingly, how he had been convinced that his presence in Egypt served a strategic purpose, not to train an enemy, but to maintain detailed observation and reporting on Soviet military activities in the Middle East. The British, Stenzel wrote, had arranged for him to transmit monthly technical assessments of Egyptian military modernization efforts to a secure address in London, through a cutout system involving a British embassy employee, and a coded letter system using invisible ink and specific newspaper advertisements. The 5th layer contained physical evidence that would require forensic analysis. Embedded in the box's false bottom were 3 objects: a military identification tag with the name France Stenzel and Wehrmacht unit designation stamped onto worn metal, a wedding band inscribed with initials FS and a date, 15 VI 1949, and most provocatively, a single photograph showing Stenzel with a woman, approximately 35 years old, both dressed formally, standing before an unidentified European church. The woman was not identified in any contemporary Egyptian records. The church was eventually identified as belonging to a Protestant congregation in the Heliopolis district of Cairo, suggesting Stenzel had secretly married sometime in 1949, establishing a personal life completely unknown to his official handlers. But the 6th container held something that changed everything. When conservators carefully removed the bottom section of the steel box, they discovered a second compartment containing what appeared to be operational correspondence, letters written in code, some typed, some handwritten, dating from between 1948 and 1971. These were communications between Stenzel and persons identified only by initials and code names. Preliminary cryptographic analysis by German military historians suggested these were intelligence reports, encoded observations about Egyptian military development, Soviet equipment performance in Egyptian service, and most disturbingly, assessments of Israeli military capabilities based on Egyptian training and battlefield reports. One document dated June 1967, just days after the Six-Day War, contained a technical analysis of Israeli tactics against Egyptian armor, apparently compiled from interviews with Egyptian officers who had survived the conflict. The implication was staggering. Stenzel had not merely been a technical advisor. He had been running an intelligence operation, collecting and encoding sensitive military information throughout his 23 years in Egypt, potentially providing crucial intelligence to Western powers about Soviet equipment performance, Egyptian military capabilities, and even Israeli military doctrine. The discovery of France Stenzel's hidden archive forced a complete reassessment of post-war intelligence operations and the mysterious network of Nazi specialists who disappeared after 1945. Declassified documents subsequently released by the British National Archives revealed that Operation Paperclip, the famous American program to recruit German scientists, was only the most visible component of a much larger and more complicated intelligence operation involving the British, the Americans, and other Western nations. The British had maintained their own parallel program, codenamed Odessa, which systematically relocated valuable Nazi military experts to positions where they could be monitored and exploited for their technical knowledge. Stenzel was one of approximately 847 German military officers and technicians who were relocated through this program between 1945 and 1952. The Egyptian placement was not unique, but it was particularly significant because it occurred in a geopolitical vacuum, a region of secondary strategic importance during the immediate post-war years, where a single technical advisor could exert outsized influence without extensive oversight. Stenzel's training of Egyptian officers directly shaped the tactics that Egyptian forces would employ throughout the 1950s and 1960s, including during the failed confrontation with Israel in 1967. This meant, in effect, that German tank warfare doctrine, refined through years of combat experience, had directly influenced Middle Eastern military conflict through an indirect but traceable chain of transmission. Israeli military historians, upon learning of Stenzel's presence in Egypt, immediately recognized that the tank tactics they had encountered throughout the 1950s and 1960s bore distinctive characteristics consistent with German armor doctrine. The connection was not coincidental, it was systematic. This revelation vindicated the suspicions of investigators like Christopher Hartley, who had been systematically silenced in the 1950s. Declassified British intelligence files showed that Hartley's 1952 report had been suppressed not because it was inaccurate, but precisely because it was accurate. The British Foreign Office had known exactly where Stenzel was and had deliberately concealed that knowledge. Hartley's investigation threatened to expose a program that was too valuable to be compromised by truth-telling. The decision to reassign Hartley and seal his files was an act of institutional self-protection. In one of the documents discovered in Stenzel's archive, there was actually a reference to Hartley's investigation, a coded memo dated March 1952 that read, "The Boffin in London is asking uncomfortable questions. The apparatus has been informed. The problem will be managed." This suggested that British intelligence had actively worked to suppress Hartley's investigation, and that Hartley himself might have been deliberately removed from his position to prevent further complications. The wider escape network that protected Stenzel, involved at minimum 247, confirmed Nazi military specialists who were relocated to Middle Eastern positions between 1945 and 1955. Records subsequently discovered showed that this network included not just tank commanders like Stenzel, but also aeronautical engineers, signals specialists, and weapons designers. Many of them had established similarly mundane lives in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, working as technical advisors while simultaneously conducting intelligence-gathering operations for Western agencies. The arrangement was elegant in its cynicism. The West recruited the enemy's experts, put them to work in strategically valuable locations, monitored their activities through control officers, and extracted valuable intelligence about Soviet equipment and Arab military development. The Nazis got to survive, to maintain their expertise, and to continue their work. Everyone benefited except for the fundamental principle of accountability. Stenzel's intelligence transmissions to London began in December 1947, just 12 weeks after his arrival in Cairo, and continued until 1971, 23 years of monthly encoded reports. A conservative estimate suggests he transmitted approximately 275 separate intelligence assessments, many of which dealt with technical military matters that were subsequently incorporated into Western military doctrine. When NATO developed its understanding of how Soviet tanks performed in non-European environments, and how Arab armies adapted mechanized warfare tactics to desert conditions, they were drawing in part on information gathered and transmitted by Franz Stenzel, the man they officially believed to be dead. This explains why certain Israeli military decisions in the 1960s appear, in retrospect, to have been based on accurate predictions of Egyptian tactical behavior. The intelligence advantage Israel enjoyed against Egypt during the 1967 Six-Day War was not simply a product of superior Israeli training or morale. It also reflected decades of accumulated intelligence gathered by Western observers embedded within the Egyptian military apparatus. Stenzel had contributed to that intelligence flow, making him, in an oblique and complicated way, participant in Israeli military operations against Arab forces, nearly 20 years after the end of World War II.